On the morning of November 10th, 1990, 21-year-old Jamie Paxton set out into the woods to go hunting. Little did he know, he was stepping into the crosshairs of a predator. And before the day was over, Jamie Paxton was gunned down in brutal fashion. His mother, completely devastated, took some unusual actions and actually tried to reach out to her son's killer by writing him letters which were published in the local newspaper. Unless you confess your sin and ask for God's forgiveness, you will face the fire and fury of hell. We want to know why Jamie was killed. The police told her that writing these letters was useless. The killer either wouldn't see them or he just didn't care. But then, after a year of calling the killer out in her writing, the local newspaper received a horrific response letter in the mail. I am the murderer of Jamie Paxton. 5 minutes after I shot Paxton, I was drinking a beer and had blocked out all thoughts of what I had just done out of my mind. I thought no more of shooting Paxton than shooting a bottle at the dump. The letter was obviously shocking, but what was even more shocking is that this letter was much more than just a confession to the one murder. This letter was the first clue into a web of violence and, yes, murder, a web that was so evil that even the FBI was left stunned. When they read this letter, they instantly knew that they were looking for the worst and most elusive type of criminal, a serial killer who hunted humans for fun. Folks, this is the story of the Ohio outdoorsman killer. When most people picture a crime scene, they usually picture, I don't know, a city street, the inside of a home, or maybe even a bank. They usually don't picture a peaceful, green, rural setting. But for our story today, that's exactly where we're going. So with that said, let's take a trip together right now to rural Ohio. This trip is totally free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you're a repeat viewer. So that's right, destroy the subscribe button, do it right now, and okay, let's head to Tuscarora County, Ohio. On the crisp morning of April 1st, 1989, 35-year-old Donald Welling laced up his running shoes and set out for a jog along the quiet rural dirt roads near his home. It just so happened to be April Fool's Day, but there was no humor in what fate had in store for Donald. He would end up being gunned down at point-blank range, his body left to rot on the side of the road. Now, investigators quickly swarmed the scene, but they were disappointed to find that the killer had left approximately zero evidence behind. And thus, Donald's killing seemed like it was an isolated incident, and the case quickly went cold. And then, over a year later, on November 10th, 1990, 21-year-old Jamie Paxton awoke early in the morning to go out and partake in his favorite pastime. That was hunting. He grabbed his crossbow, he said goodbye to his parents that he lived with, and then he set off from his Belmont County home, eager to go find the perfect spot to bag a deer. He drove for a while, and then he finally found a very promising field which was located just off of Route 9. He pulled in, he parked his truck, and then he actually strolled into the field completely unarmed in order to just kind of feel things out, to kind of just, scope things out. He was so focused on doing that he never noticed the red pickup truck that pulled in behind his car. Jamie Paxton never returned from his hunt. His body was found in that very same field, dead from multiple gunshot wounds. No shell casings, No footprints or any other evidence was found at the scene. Jamie Paxton had no known enemies, and the motive for his brutal murder was entirely unknown. His killing, like the killing of Donald Welling, seemed as random as it was brutal. But together, these two killings hinted at something far darker that was lurking in the shadows, a connection that I'm making sound obvious, but the authorities had not yet to make. Folks, the killings were only getting started, but before we go any further into that, it's already so tense and disturbing. I want to bring that down for a moment. Let's take a deep breath and let's lighten things up while I tell you about Drink Element. They happen to be the sponsor of this video. What a coincidence, I know. And Drink Element will make a fantastic holiday gift for your sweaty loved ones, which is a bold statement, so here's what I mean. Now, when you sweat, it's really important that you replace your electrolytes so that you can avoid fatigue and muscle cramps and other problems like that. Drink Element is the best electrolyte drink mix to do this, and they just recently launched their chocolate medley, which includes creative flavors like chocolate raspberry, chocolate chai, and chocolate mint. This is going to be a great gift, and it's going to allow your loved one to get creative with their electrolyte drinks. You know, they can go for a workout, and then when they're having their coffee afterwards or their hot chocolate at night or whatever it is, they can add some Element to it, and they can also look at Element's recipe page for more cool ideas. Element has so many amazing flavors, and they even have something called Element Sparkling if you prefer carbonation with your hydration. I absolutely love it. And right now, if you go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking, that's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. If you go there and you make a purchase, you're gonna get a sample pack of 8 additional flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost. This is a fantastic deal. It's the best one you're gonna find on the internet. And so one more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Go get a good gift for your sweaty loved one. And now back to the story. 18 days after Jamie Paxton's murder, 30-year-old Kevin Loring went out hunting in Muskingum County, Ohio. Loring actually wasn't from Ohio. He was from Duxbury, Massachusetts, but he had traveled to Ohio in order to visit some friends and, of course, to do what he loved, aka hunting. He really wanted to bag a deer. So Loring and his friends set out early in the morning, but at some point, the group had separated. Kevin Loring's friends never saw him again. Kevin went missing until he was discovered the very next day, dead from a gunshot wound. Now, at first, authorities dismissed this tragedy as a hunting accident, which is a rare but not exactly unheard of occurrence in the remote Ohio countryside. Kevin Loring's family, left totally shattered by his loss, began to grieve the man who was a father of 3 young children. And to them, this was a senseless and heartbreaking loss, but it was nothing more. It wasn't a crime. It wasn't something that was going to turn into a national case. His family couldn't have known the truth that was just lurking out of reach at the time, but within months, the investigation into Kevin's death would be reopened, and this chilling reality would emerge. Kevin Loring's death was no hunting accident. In fact, Kevin Loring had actually been hunted himself. Flash forward to March 14th, 1992, and 49-year-old Claude Hawkins has just finished working his overnight shift at the perfect time to go enjoy some morning fishing. The Wills Creek Dam in Coshocton County, Ohio, was his favorite fishing spot. It was a quiet refuge where he could just relax after a long night's work overnight. Tragically, Claude was found dead at this very spot that he loved so much, his fishing pole lying abandoned beside him. Claude had been killed by a gunshot fired at extremely close range. Now, he had actually been standing on federal land when he was shot, which placed the investigation into the hands of the FBI. As these FBI agents combed through the case, they began to uncover a terrifying truth. Claude's murder wasn't a standalone act of violence. It was part of something far bigger and far more sinister. Up until now, the 3 murders and the 1 accident that I've told you about so far weren't connected. The authorities hadn't pieced it together. Each of these crimes occurred in a different rural county scattered across Ohio with limited local resources to tie them together. Investigators in one county had no idea that their case might be linked to another county, leaving the crimes isolated in their records. But when the FBI stepped in, the pattern became unmistakable. The murders weren't just random acts of violence. They were meticulously calculated, each one committed in a location designed to stay just out of reach of local authorities. This killer had woven a web of terror across the state of Ohio, exploiting jurisdictional gaps in order to remain undetected. To the FBI, it was clear. They weren't just dealing with a killer, they were hunting a predator who had mastered the art of evasion and the evil act of hunting itself. When the FBI took over the investigation, they uncovered the chilling truth that Kevin Loring's death hadn't been a hunting accident after all. And with this revelation, Loring's name was added to the growing list of victims that were claimed by this elusive and calculating serial killer. Next, the FBI took a close look at all 4 murders, and when they did this, they came to an extremely troubling realization. There was almost 0 evidence in any of these cases. The killer had been super careful. He had removed shell casings. He didn't leave any DNA. He didn't leave any fingerprints. He left no trace of his presence. The only lead that the FBI had was a single typed letter received by the Ferry Times Leader newspaper on November 4th, 1991. This letter's origin lay in the grief-stricken determination of one woman. That would be Jamie Paxton's mother, Jean Paxton. Devastated by her son's brutal death, Jean refused to stand by and just wait for justice. Instead, she took an extraordinary step and she poured her anguish, her heartbreak, and all of her emotions into open letters addressed to her son's killer. These letters were filled with confusion, desperation, pleas, just very brutal stuff, and they were published in the Ferry Times Leader for the world, the entire world, and the killer to see. Little did Jean know, but her words would eventually spark a response that would shock everybody. She wrote, "To the murderer of my son, Jamie, would it be easier for you if I wrote words of hate? I can't, because I don't feel hate. I feel deep sorrow at losing my son. You took a light from my life November 10th and left me with many days of darkness. Have you thought of your own death? Unless you confess your sin and ask for God's forgiveness, you will face the fire and fury of hell. When you are caught, I will be sorry for your family. They will have to carry the burden of your guilt all their lives." I want to stress that this was not just a one-off letter, folks. Jean Paxton published letter after letter addressed to her son's killer. She did this for almost a year. Oh, and by the way, she did this without ever getting a response. But then, just before the 1-year anniversary of her son's death, this disturbing letter arrived at the Ferry Times Leader. "I am the murderer of Jamie Paxton. Jamie Paxton was a complete stranger to me. I never saw him before in my life, and he never said a word to me that Saturday. Paxton was killed because of an irresistible compulsion that has taken over my life. I knew when I left my house that day that someone would die by my hand. Technically, I meet the definition of a serial killer, but I'm an average-looking person with a family, job, and home just like yourself. Something in my head causes me to turn into a merciless killer with no conscience. To the Paxtons, you deserve to know the details. And folks, go into the details he did. The anonymous typewritten letter went on to say, quote, "I raised my rifle to my shoulder and lined him up in the sights. It took at least 5 seconds to take careful aim. My first shot was off a little bit and hit him in the right chest. He groaned and went down. I wanted to make sure he was finished, so I fired a second shot aimed halfway between his hip and shoulder. He was crawling around on the ground. I jerked the shot and hit him in the knee. He raised his head and groaned again. My third shot also missed and hit him in the butt. He never moved again." The letter continued on, but by this point in it, the FBI knew that this letter was not a hoax. They knew that the real killer had to have written it because he had given details in the letter, details about the killing of Jamie Paxton that were not public. I'm talking details that only the FBI and the killer himself could possibly know. The letter went on, showing just how cold and evil this mysterious man truly was. 5 minutes after I shot Paxton, I was drinking a beer and had blocked out all thoughts of what I had just done out of my mind. I thought no more of shooting Paxton than shooting a bottle at the dump. Signed, the murderer of Jamie Paxton. Now, those are probably some of the most disturbing words I've ever read out loud before. Now, this letter didn't contain any fingerprints. It didn't contain any DNA. It didn't contain anything at all that would point in the direction of who this serial killer was. At first, the letter seemed like yet another hopeless lead. But the FBI soon realized that the letter was actually riddled with evidence that could help capture this monster who was roaming Ohio's backroads. All the FBI had to do was just get a little more creative. The FBI studied every little detail about this letter. They studied the author's word choice, the tone that he wrote in, even the cadence of his sentences. And what they were doing was putting together a behavioral profile of the Ohio outdoorsman killer, attempting to understand his personality, his habits, and of course, his motivations. The FBI and local investigators would end up forming a task force designed to finally bring down this serial killer. And just a few days after this task force first met, 44-year-old Gary Bradley left his home in West Virginia, crossed into the state of Ohio, and settled in at a fishing spot in Noble County. His secluded location made it a perfect place for a quiet escape, or so Gary thought, but what he didn't realize was that he wasn't alone. Undetected, the Ohio outdoorsman killer had already marked Gary as prey in the deadliest game imaginable. Like the victims before him, Gary Bradley was mercilessly gunned down with a high-powered rifle. When investigators arrived, they were met with the same frustrating reality as all of the previous cases. There was no shell casings, no fingerprints. There was no leads at all. Nothing pointed to who did this. The only thing they had were a couple tiny fragments of some of the bullets that were extracted from Gary's body, which would go on to match some of the bullets that killed Claude Hawkins, which confirmed the FBI's worst fear. The very same cold-blooded killer that they were trying so desperately to track down had killed Gary Bradley. And thus, the FBI sheepishly added a fifth person to the list of victims from this serial killer. And they did this, and then without looking back, they dove into the killer's psyche, ramping up their efforts to create this profile that might finally bring this hunter of men to justice. They knew that they had to act fast because it was crystal clear that the Ohio outdoorsman killer would not be stopping his rampage anytime soon. So they're trying to create this profile, and the only even slight glimpse into the mind of this killer was from that letter that was sent to Gene Paxton. Other than that, the only things they had to go off of were the actual details of the 5 murders. And they quickly noticed that all 5 murder victims were in the process of enjoying the outdoors when they were killed. They were either hunting, fishing, or jogging. The FBI also noticed that most of the slayings occurred on a Saturday. And finally, they noticed that all victims were men. The FBI's behavioral profile painted a chilling picture of the Ohio outdoorsman killer. They concluded that he was likely a white male. He was likely over 30 years old with a deeply introverted nature. But at the same time, he wasn't a recluse. You know, he was skilled, he was calculated, and he was comfortable, even you could say dangerously comfortable, in the wilderness. The killer was probably an avid outdoorsman himself, someone who knew how to hunt, fish, and certainly someone who knew how to handle firearms with expert precision. The profile didn't stop there either. It suggested a disturbing pattern of criminal habits beyond just these murders. The killer was likely an alcoholic, prone to drinking himself into reckless acts of destruction, things like vandalism, shooting at empty vehicles, setting fires, and even torturing animals. These were the dark hobbies of a man who had basically grown numb to violence. He likely lived close enough to all of his victims so that he could strike quickly and strike without hesitation, blending back into the rural fabric of Ohio with total ease. So that's what they came up with. That's how they profiled this killer. And at first, they used this profile to try and narrow down their list of suspects. However, this didn't bring them any closer to finding the identity of the killer. By the start of August in 1992, they were feeling more and more pressure to do this. The killer could basically strike again at any moment, and the FBI knew that they were running out of time. This desperation would lead the FBI to a very bold decision. They decided that they were going to go public with their profile. So they unleashed this profile to the press in the hopes that someone, anyone, might recognize the monster hiding in plain sight. And by the way, the FBI didn't just release their behavioral profile, they released a chilling warning. With hunting season on the horizon, the FBI cautioned the public that while most sportsmen would be aiming for deer, one man was going to be preparing to actually hunt the hunters. The FBI's announcement sent shockwaves throughout the state of Ohio, sparking widespread fear and intense media attention. Pretty much immediately upon releasing this, the FBI was bombarded with tips and also with new suspects. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming, but it also didn't take long for one individual lead to rise above the rest of the noise. A man stepped forward claiming that a former friend of his matched the behavioral profile of the killer almost perfectly. Now, the FBI was skeptical at first, but of course, they dug into this lead. And when they did this, what they found left no doubt. This informant was 100% telling the truth. And so for the first time, the FBI had a potential name that could actually be tied to the Ohio outdoorsman killer. And the name was Thomas Lee Dillon. So this high school friend of Dillon's had approached the FBI saying, quote, "I saw the reports about the task force that had been formed to solve the killings, and I just think I got a guy who should be investigated as a possible suspect." This man went on to recall how, when they were younger, himself and Thomas Dillon used to get drunk and then drive around town causing trouble. This trouble included things like starting small fires, shooting at unoccupied vehicles, and just vandalizing things around town. Already a few red flags there. But then the man told investigators a story about Dillon, which was far more troubling. The man said, quote, "I remember we ran into a couple of scraggly dogs one time. They were all diseased. They were sick. Tom said, 'Do you think I ought to kill them?' And I said, 'Well, you'd probably be doing them a favor.' I remember him shooting them. I didn't think too much about it. wild dogs can be vicious. Then he started shooting dogs, just dogs, along the road. I said, Tom, shooting a wild dog is one thing, but that dog doesn't look very wild to me. He said, you can't let them damn things be running around. I let it go by once or twice, but then I said, Tom, you gotta quit it or I won't go out with you. Those are somebody's pets. Somebody loves them. This informant would go on to say that eventually he kind of just grew up and he stopped hanging around Thomas Dillon. But then in 1986, only a few years before the murders started, he ran into Dillon again at a gun show. A lot of time had passed, and so this man decided to give Dillon another chance. So they went for a drive together, and it quickly became apparent that Thomas Dillon, well, he hadn't changed one iota. On this drive, Thomas Dillon kept bringing up the concept of serial killers, including probably the most famous one, Ted Bundy. He told his friend, quote, do you realize you can go out into the country and find somebody and there are no witnesses? You can shoot them. And as if that wasn't disturbing enough, Thomas Dillon asked his old friend if he thought that he had ever killed someone. Quoting from the friend, Tom said, do you think I've ever killed somebody? The question really caught me off guard. I said, no, I don't think so. And he said, that just proves you don't know me very well. Every detail that this informant shared with the FBI pointed squarely at Thomas Dillon as the Ohio outdoorsman killer. I mean, he matched the FBI's profile perfectly. Dillon had a disturbing criminal history, including vandalism, burglary, and animal torture. He was an avid hunter, he was well-versed in the wilderness, and he also owned an arsenal of weapons. That is exactly what the profile predicted. And it gets even worse, folks, because one of the most chilling revelations about Thomas Dillon was actually some of his own advice that he gave to his friend turned informant. Dillon told his friend that if you're going to go on a killing spree, you ought to make sure to spread the murders across multiple counties. His reasoning for this being it would make it harder to connect them and harder to solve them, which is precisely the situation that the investigators initially found themselves in. This statement, this evil advice that Thomas Dillon gave, turned suspicion into straight up certainty, at least in the eyes of the FBI. And yet, there would be no arrest of Thomas Dillon, let alone an actual conviction, without any hard evidence. So the FBI, they went to work relentlessly digging into every corner of Dillon's life. They set up surveillance, watching his every move, and one of their first steps was to actually investigate Dillon's employer, the Canton Water Department. Upon doing this, it didn't take long for the FBI to make a very chilling discovery. Thomas Dillon had Saturdays off. Again, that was the exact day of the week when most of the murders occurred. But it gets even more unsettling because Thomas Dillon's rare midweek vacation days, the time that he would take off, not very often, well, those days also lined up perfectly with the dates of the other killings. The FBI went to Dillon's employer to try and rule him out, but all this did was further point the finger at him. And then they discovered even more chilling evidence which linked Thomas Dillon to the murders. In the response letter that was sent to Gene Paxton, the killer had brazenly mentioned visiting Jamie Paxton's grave. This revelation led investigators to set up a hidden camera at the cemetery. And for a long time, they had all this footage, but they didn't really have anything to do with it. But now that they had a suspect, well, they began to comb through the footage, and, well, what they ended up capturing was both horrifying and completely undeniable. The FBI found footage showing Thomas Dillon stopping at Jamie's grave on the 1-year anniversary of Jamie Paxton's murder. Add that to the list of circumstantial evidence against Thomas Dillon. And yet, again, that's all they had was circumstantial evidence. They needed more. They needed something forensic, or I don't know. They just needed some hard evidence. in order to actually convince a jury that he was guilty and to bring Dillon down. The FBI used cars, trucks, vehicles, and also aircraft to keep Thomas Dillon under surveillance. And while they were doing these stakeouts, they witnessed him multiple times, by the way, shooting at street signs, electrical meters, and other things along the rural Ohio roads. They even witnessed him shooting at animals. Now, any of these acts was an arrestable offense, obviously, but investigators held off. They were hoping to catch Thomas Dillon in the act of something that was much more incriminating, something that would land him in jail for a long time or allow them to convict him for one of the murders. But it was impossible to watch Thomas Dillon 24/7, especially at the beginning of the surveillance period before the evidence had stacked up even more. And thus, in the early fall of 1992, Thomas Dillon went hunting, and unfortunately, the FBI was not around to stop him. Larry Oler took to the woods to try and go get a deer one morning in Tuscarawas County. He parked his car at the edge of the forest, and then he hiked over 100 yards, past the length of a football field into the woods, when all of a sudden, he heard a truck pull in nearby. He watched in horror as this red pickup truck stopped and a man with a rifle gut out, pointing it in Oler's directions. He had only seconds to react, and when he heard the first shot ring out, Larry Oler decided to just drop to the ground and play dead. Folks, thank God this worked. It did. The killer was convinced that he had actually hit his target, and so he got back into his truck and he drove off. Larry Oler was completely unharmed, and he was even able to provide the police with a description of the truck. After this incident, the FBI knew that they were running out of time. They felt that pressure before, but now it was just completely confirmed. Thomas Dillon wasn't just a suspect, he was a ticking time bomb, and the FBI were certain that he'd strike again if they left him free. But again, it would be difficult to arrest him. They had plenty of circumstantial evidence, but they lacked that smoking gun that would tie him directly to the murders. Arresting him on a minor charge might buy them a little bit of time, but it also came with a very dangerous gamble. If the FBI couldn't gather solid evidence quickly, Dillon would soon walk free, and their chance to bring him to justice might slip away forever. But hunting season was right around the corner, and the FBI were very worried that Dillon would go out and, do his own sick version of hunting. And so, the FBI eventually decided to make the risky move of arresting Thomas Dillon on a minor weapons charge, and they just hoped that they could find some more hard evidence before he was released from jail on this charge. They started with a good old-fashioned interrogation, hoping that they could convince Thomas Dillon that the evidence was so strong that he might as well just confess. This is a tactic that works on many people, but unfortunately, it failed miserably on Thomas Dillon. He immediately asked for his attorney, and he invoked his Fifth Amendment rights. And so next, investigators zeroed in on Dillon's home in Magnolia, Ohio, pouring through his possessions, just praying to find any piece of evidence that would link him to the murders. This, unfortunately, also failed very miserably. They didn't find anything, and it was beginning to look like the FBI had hit yet another dead end. Running out of options, they were pretty much left with no other choice but to make another desperate plea to the public. The FBI openly admitted that Thomas Dillon was the prime suspect in the Outdoorsman murders, and they pleaded with anyone who might have information on Dillon to contact them. In particular, they asked for any information about the weapons that Dillon had used. And then, finally, the FBI got a break that would quickly turn into a bombshell. In early December 1992, a man came forward and said that he had bought a rifle from Thomas Dillon earlier that year. The man still had the receipt from the purchase, proving that he had actually acquired the rifle from Dillon, and the FBI seized this gun. They immediately shipped it to their headquarters in Virginia and started running ballistics tests. These tests would prove that this was the very same rifle that had been used to kill Gary Bradley and Claude Hawkins. This was the crucial piece of evidence the FBI had been searching for so long, a direct link between Thomas Dillon and the murders. He'd finally been caught red-handed, and he was indicted for those two murders I just mentioned there, the murder of Gary Bradley and the murder of Claude Hawkins. And then, shortly after that, he was also indicted for the murder of Jamie Paxton. Thomas Dillon would initially plead not guilty, but this would soon change. Before his trial commenced, Thomas Dillon suddenly changed his mind and confessed to all 5 of the murders. He admitted to the press and to the prosecutors that he just had this unexplainable compulsion to kill. It was something that he couldn't and wouldn't control. He also expressed zero regret about the evil actions that he had taken. And only once did he ever show the tiniest bit of remorse. And that's something I'm going to be coming back to in just a moment. Thomas Dillon would go on to strike a deal with the prosecution that if he pled guilty to the murders, he would receive a life sentence without parole, but he would avoid receiving the death penalty. That was something that Thomas Dillon really wanted to avoid, which is ironic, to put it mildly, given what he did to all these innocent people. Ultimately, this deal went forward. He received a life sentence, he was spared the death penalty, and he never really fully received ultimate justice for what he had done. But at the same time, this plea deal did help speed up all of the legal proceedings, and it allowed the victims' families to begin rebuilding and moving on much sooner than if it had dragged out in trial. Thomas Dillon was a monster. He just couldn't contain his urge to kill. And if he hadn't been arrested, there's pretty much zero doubt on anybody's mind that he would have killed again and again until he was finally stopped. He had no respect for his victims, and he felt no guilt after killing them, with the exception of one victim. That was Jamie Paxton. Thomas Dillon was quoted in reference to his murder of Paxton, saying, "I didn't know he was that young. I couldn't see how old he was from a distance. I thought he was 30, 35. I didn't know he was that young. Blew that kid away, you know. He had his whole life ahead of him, and I blew him away. I felt sorry for him." In that quote, Thomas Dillon makes it seem like Jamie Paxton's age was the reason for his remorse. But to be honest with you, I think that there's actually an additional reason that Thomas Dillon expressed guilt for Jamie Paxton's murder. I think that he did this because of the relentless efforts of Jamie's mother. All of the letters that she wrote to Jamie's killer. I talked about that a lot in this video. And she also later made phone calls to Thomas Dillon after he was already behind bars. I think that she got through to him. I think that she was the only person on earth who was able to crack Thomas Dillon's psychopathic mind and force him to confront the remorse that he actually felt deep down inside of him. My heart goes out to her, and of course to her son, Jamie. Please keep them and the rest of the victims in your hearts. And as for Thomas Dillon, I wouldn't worry too much about him, because he would go on to spend the rest of his life behind bars, eventually dying from cancer in 2011. Folks, show some love for the victims in the comments below, and I'll see all of you next week. If you're in the Denver, Colorado area on Saturday, December 7th, 2024, I will be doing a live podcast with Backpacker Radio talking about my experiences through hiking, various hiking related topics, and I will be sharing a brand new trail mystery that has not yet been covered on my channel. Tickets are going fast. It's going to sell out. So one more time, Denver, Colorado, December 7th. Details and tickets will be in the description.